Welcome to Noir Street. Like, subscribe, and stay with the mystery. Tell me, which part of the world are you watching from?
Chapter 1. The man who wore a perfect white scarf. There are many things a person can forgive about a stranger. A strange hat, an unusual coat, a peculiar manner of speaking. New York is a city built on people being unusual. A person can walk down almost any street wearing something unexpected and still disappear into the crowd within minutes. But a perfectly white scarf on a rainy evening is different. That is the kind of detail that refuses to disappear. It announces itself. It asks to be noticed, and sometimes, as I have learned after years of working for Nero Wolfe, the things that demand attention are the things that have been carefully designed to distract from something else. My name is Archie Goodwin, and I have spent enough time observing human behavior to know that people rarely dress only for comfort. They dress for impressions. They dress for memories. They dress because they want someone to see them. The gentleman in the white scarf wanted to be seen. The question was why. The rain had started shortly after sunset on Riddle Street. It was the kind of rain New York produces when the city appears to be tired of itself. Not a storm, not dramatic, just a steady grey curtain covering the streets, making windows glow warmer and empty sidewalks appear longer. At the end of Riddle Street stood the Whitmore estate. It was an old property surrounded by iron fencing and tall trees that had survived decades of construction, renovations, and changing owners. The house belonged to Charles Whitmore, a man whose name was known throughout the neighborhood, not because he was famous, because he was careful. Charles Whitmore was the kind of man who believed privacy was a form of wealth. He kept his business affairs organized, his friendships limited, and his personal history locked away from anyone who showed too much curiosity. Naturally, that made people curious. A person with nothing to hide usually does not work so hard to appear impossible to understand. The first person to notice the man in the white scarf was Helen Morris. She lived across from the Whitmore estate and had the habit of watching the street from her front window every evening. Not because she was a gossip. At least, that was what she always claimed. She simply believed that observing the world was better than allowing the world to pass unnoticed. Approximately 8:30. She saw the gentleman enter the estate. Her description was simple: a dark coat, a black hat, a white scarf, nothing else. That was the strange part. She could remember the scarf perfectly. Not the face, not the height, not the age, not the voice, only the scarf. It was impossible not to notice, she later told Detective Thomas Reed. Why? Because everything else looked like it belonged to the weather. She looked toward the rainy street. The coat was dark. The night was dark. The house was dark. But the scarf looked untouched, like it had never met the rain. At first, nobody considered the scarf important. That was understandable. A scarf was a scarf. Detectives deal with evidence, not clothing choices. But then Charles Whitmore was found dead. And suddenly, the smallest detail became the largest question. The call reached Nero Wolfe's brownstone the following morning. I was in the office when the telephone rang. Wolfe was behind his desk reading a collection of reports, while pretending that the outside world had not invented thousands of ways to interrupt him. That was one of Wolfe's talents. He could ignore almost anything: a telephone, a visitor, a crisis. Unless the crisis contained an interesting problem, then he noticed immediately. I answered. Nero Wolfe's office, Archie Goodwin speaking. The voice belonged to Thomas Reed. That told me enough. Reed did not call Wolfe unless the case had reached the point where ordinary methods had stopped being comfortable. Archie. Inspector. I need Wolfe. That depends. On what? Whether you have a problem or merely a headache. A pause. Then a murder. I looked toward Wolfe. He had not moved, but he was listening. Of course he was. I covered the receiver. Murder. Wolfe extended his hand. I passed him the telephone. For several minutes, he said almost nothing. That was Wolfe's way. Most people believed silence meant they were not receiving information. With Wolf, silence meant information was being collected. Finally, he said, "Yes." A pause. "Number Oz. I will send Goodwin." Then he returned the telephone. I looked at him. "You knew I was going?" "Yes." "Before you knew the details?" "Yes." "How?" "Because Reed called." That was not an explanation. It was a Wolf explanation. Morning reveals them. The house was impressive, but not welcoming. Large windows, expensive stonework, carefully maintained gardens. Everything suggested success. Nothing suggested happiness. Detective Reed met us at the entrance. He looked tired. That was common. Murder investigations have a way of making everyone look like they have lost an argument with time. Wolf, Reed, Goodwin, still here. Reed ignored me. Whitmore was found inside his private library. Cause of death? Wolf asked. A single blow to the head. Weapon? Unknown. Forced entry. Number? Then the killer was invited, most likely. Shelves covered the walls. A fireplace stood cold. A desk rested near the window. Charles Whitmore sat in his chair. Everything appeared orderly. Almost too orderly. Nothing disturbed. Wolf asked. Very little. Very little means something was disturbed. Reed looked uncomfortable. One thing. What? The scarf. The white scarf lay on the floor beside the desk, clean bright, almost impossible to ignore, exactly like the witness had described. Wolf studied it. He did not touch it. He simply looked. "What do you think?" Reed asked. Wolf remained silent. That usually meant he was thinking. After a moment, he said, "It is not clothing." Reed frowned. "What?" "It resembles clothing." "Because it is a scarf." Wolf looked at him. "Because someone wanted us to believe it was one." That was the first moment the case changed. The white scarf was no longer a description. It was a message. Someone had placed it where it would be found. Someone had arranged it carefully. Someone wanted the investigation to begin there. I looked at the scarf again. A bright white object on a dark, rainy night. A symbol, a signal, a deliberate choice. "Who owned it?" Wolf asked. Reed opened his notebook. "That is the problem." "Explain." "Nobody knows. Nobody." The witness saw the man entering with it. Whitmore was not wearing it, and no one in the house recognizes it. Wolf nodded. Interesting, there was that word. The word that usually meant the trouble had become more complicated. Later, we learned more about Charles Whitmore. He had no obvious enemies. That was always suspicious. People with money often collected enemies without realizing it. Whitmore had business disagreements, old arguments, broken partnerships, but nothing that immediately explained murder. The strange thing was not who disliked him. The strange thing was what he had been investigating before his death. 3 weeks earlier, Whitmore had begun searching through old family records, property documents, letters, historical files, the same kind of forgotten information that had appeared in the Arthur Vale investigation. Riddle Street had a habit of keeping secrets, and apparently people had a habit of killing to protect them. That evening, back at the brownstone, Wolf sat behind his desk while Fritz prepared dinner upstairs. The scent of something excellent moved through the house. For most people, a fine meal would have been a welcome distraction. For Wolf, it was simply part of maintaining order. A detective with poor habits was an inefficient detective. At least, that was Wolf's argument. "Archie." "Yes." "What did the witness remember?" "The scarf. Only the scarf." "Yes." "Interesting." I smiled. "You said that already." "Because it remains true. You think the witness missed something?" Then what?" "I think the witness remembered exactly what someone wanted remembered." That was Wolf's first conclusion, and with Wolf, first conclusions were rarely wrong. The man in the white scarf had not left behind a clue. He had left behind a performance, a carefully arranged image, a message placed in front of everyone. The question was whether it was a warning or a confession, and somewhere on Riddle Street, someone knew the answer. Someone who had walked through the rain wearing a perfectly clean white scarf. Someone who wanted to be remembered. Chapter 2. The mark hidden in the fabric. The first mistake people make when they see a strange object is assuming the object is the mystery. It usually is not. The object is only the beginning. A locked drawer is not mysterious because it is locked. It is mysterious because someone decided there was something worth locking away. A missing letter is not important because paper disappeared. It is important because someone feared what the words could reveal. And a perfectly white scarf on a rainy night is not interesting because it is unusual. It is interesting because someone wanted it to be remembered. That was the first thing Nero Wolfe understood about the Whitmore murder. The scarf was not evidence left behind by accident. It was a message deliberately placed where someone would find it. The only question was whether the person who left it wanted to reveal something or hide something. The morning after our visit to the Whitmore estate, the brownstone on West 35th Street returned to its usual rhythm. That meant Fritz Brenner was working in the kitchen, the orchids upstairs were receiving attention, and Nero Wolfe was occupying his chair with the confidence of a man who believed the world outside could wait until it produced a problem worth his time. I had spent the early hours reviewing Detective Thomas Reed's notes, not because Wolfe asked me to, because I had learned long ago that if I wanted to understand one of Wolfe's investigations, I had to study the facts before he transformed them into something much more complicated. The facts were simple. Charles Whitmore was dead. His library showed no signs of forced entry. A stranger had been seen leaving the estate. The stranger wore a white scarf. The scarf was the only thing anyone remembered clearly. Everything else about the man had disappeared into uncertainty. That was not normal. People remember faces. Not always correctly, not always completely. But faces are what human beings are trained to notice. A person can forget a name. A person can forget a voice. But when someone walks past you, the face is usually the first thing your mind records. Unless something else captures your attention, something bright, something unusual, something designed to become the only thing you remember. Archie. I looked up. Wolfe was examining the photograph of the scarf taken at the crime scene. The witness statements. What about them? Read them again. I glanced at the papers. I already did. Again. That was Wolfe. He never believed repetition was unnecessary if the second examination revealed something the first did not. I read the statements. Helen Morris, the gardener, a delivery worker, a neighbor walking a dog. All had seen the same thing, a man entering the Whitmore estate. All remembered the white scarf. None remembered the face. I looked at Wolfe. They all noticed the same detail. Yes, and ignored everything else. Yes, because the scarf was memorable. Number Wolfe corrected me immediately. Because the scarf was made memorable. That was the difference. The scarf had not simply attracted attention, it had controlled attention. Inspector Reed arrived before noon. He carried a small evidence bag. Inside was a piece of white fabric. The scarf has been examined, he said. Wolfe looked at it. And it is not commercially produced, meaning custom made. By whom? We are still investigating. Wolfe nodded. Describe it. Reed opened his notebook. The fabric is high quality. The weave is unusual. The thread count is extremely fine. Anything else? Yes. He placed the bag on the desk. There are markings. Now we think it was intentional. Wolfe picked up the magnifying glass. He examined the scarf carefully. Not quickly, not dramatically, just patiently. That was one of Wolfe's greatest abilities. He could look at something ordinary until it became impossible for anyone else to ignore. What do you see? Reed asked. Wolfe did not answer immediately. That was not because he did not know. It was because he disliked speaking before his thoughts were complete. The pattern is not decorative. Reed leaned forward. What is it? A code. I looked at the scarf again, a code hidden inside fabric. It seemed absurd. But with Wolfe, absurdity was often simply intelligence wearing unfamiliar clothing. How? Reed asked. The weaving. Wolf pointed. These variations are not mistakes. They are tiny. Yes. How did anyone notice? Because someone wanted them noticed. That statement sounded impossible. Why hide a message so carefully, and then want someone to find it? But that was the kind of contradiction that often existed in criminal behavior. People wanted secrets hidden, but they also wanted recognition. Pride was often the weakness that exposed them. The fabric was sent for detailed analysis. While we waited, Reed provided more information about Charles Whitmore, and that information changed the direction of the investigation. Whitmore had been researching his family history, Reed said. How long? Wolf asked. About a month. Why? He was looking into an old family dispute. What kind? Property. That word again, property, history, old records. Riddle Street seemed to have a talent for producing mysteries involving things people believed were already forgotten. Did he tell anyone? Only one person. Who? His niece, Clara Whitmore. Her explanation, she said Charles, believed someone from the past had returned. I looked at Wolf. Returned? His words, Reed said. What exactly did he say? Reed checked his notes. He said, the family secret was never lost. It was waiting. The room became quiet. That sentence stayed with me, because people do not usually describe family secrets as waiting. They describe them as hidden, buried, forgotten. Waiting suggested something else. Waiting suggested intention. Someone had not simply hidden something. Someone had placed something somewhere and expected a future moment to arrive. Like a message, like a trap, like a clue. The investigation into the scarf continued. The manufacturer was eventually identified. A small textile workshop that specialized in custom work for wealthy clients. The owner, Samuel Bell, remembered making it. Who ordered it? Reed asked. Bell hesitated. That hesitation mattered. Mr. Bell, I am trying to remember. You remember making a custom white scarf with unusual weaving? Yes, for whom? Bell looked uncomfortable. A man. What man? I don't know his name. Reed frowned. You made something expensive for someone whose name you don't know. He paid in advance. That is not an answer. Bell sighed. The order was delivered through an assistant. Whose assistant? I don't know. Another dead end. Except Wolf did not believe in dead ends. Only roads that had not yet been followed correctly. Everyone is remembering the wrong thing. Wolf said that evening. We were back at the brownstone. Dinner had been served. Fritz had prepared a meal that deserved attention, but Wolf was distracted. That was unusual. Wolf respected food too much to ignore it. The scarf, I said. Yes. Everyone remembers it. Yes. But nobody remembers the man. Correct. Meaning, the scarf was not meant to identify the person. I looked at him. But everyone thinks it was. Exactly. I waited. Then what was it meant to do? Wolf looked at the photograph again. To prove that the person was there. That was different. The killer did not want witnesses to identify him. The killer wanted witnesses to confirm a story. Someone wanted everyone to remember a white scarf entering the Whitmore estate. But why? The next clue came from the hidden marks in the fabric. The analysis revealed that the woven pattern contained symbols, not letters, not numbers, references. A system used in old Whitmore family documents. The scarf was connected to the same historical records. Charles Whitmore had been investigating. The person wearing the scarf knew about the family secret. More importantly, they wanted Charles Whitmore to know they knew. This was not a random murder. It was a confrontation. A message delivered in person. I returned to Wolf with the updated information. The scarf belonged to someone connected to the old family records. Yes. The killer wanted Whitmore to see it. Yes. And then they killed him. Yes. So the scarf was a warning. Wolf shook his head. Number. Then what? A challenge. That answer bothered me. A warning says, stay away. A challenge says, come and find me. The killer had not simply hidden. They had stepped into the light. They had worn the most noticeable thing possible. They had created a memory before going to bed that night. I looked again at the witness statements. Every person had remembered the same detail. A perfect white scarf. Not a face, not a voice, not a name. A scarf. And suddenly I understood why Wolf was interested. The killer had not failed to hide. The killer had chosen exactly how to be remembered. A man who wanted to disappear would have worn ordinary clothing. A man who wanted to create a legend would wear something impossible to forget. The white scarf was not the killer's mistake. It was the first line of his message. And somewhere behind that message was the answer to Charles Whitmore's murder. The mystery had not begun with a dead man in a library. It had begun years earlier with a secret someone believed was worth protecting. And now, wearing a perfect white scarf, that secret had returned. Chapter 3. The guest who left no name there are many ways to enter a house. Through the front door, through the back door, through an unlocked window when someone believes nobody is watching. But the most interesting way to enter a house is to enter officially without ever appearing to have arrived. That was the problem with the unknown guest at the Whitmore estate. Some unknown had been there. Some unknown had walked through the halls. Some unknown had spoken with Charles Whitmore on the night he died. Yet, according to the records, nobody had visited. No name, no signature, no invitation. No evidence that anyone had crossed the threshold, except for the white scarf. And by then, we had learned enough about the scarf to understand one important thing. It never appeared without a reason. The following morning at the brownstone began like most mornings at the brownstone. Wolf was in his chair. The orchids were receiving their usual attention. Fritz was preparing breakfast, and I was trying to understand why a man could solve complicated murders while refusing to acknowledge that walking upstairs was a reasonable daily activity. That was Nero Wolf. He had opinions about almost everything. Most of those opinions were delivered with complete confidence, especially when he was correct, which was irritatingly often. I was reviewing the Whitmore estate information when Wolf spoke. Archie, yes, the guest records. I looked up. What about them? Examine them again. I already did. Again. I sighed. There were two kinds of instructions from Wolf. Instructions that required work, and instructions that required repeating work, because he believed the first attempt had not been sufficiently thoughtful. This was the second kind. The Whitmore estate maintained detailed guest records. Charles Whitmore believed in organization. Every visitor was recorded. Every delivery was documented. Every appointment was noted. It was exactly the kind of system wealthy private people created, because they believed records protected them. Sometimes they did. Sometimes records simply proved that someone was clever enough to avoid them. I reviewed the entries from the night of the murder. The names were ordinary. A lawyer, a business associate, a family friend, a delivery service. Nothing unusual. Then I noticed something. A gap, not an obvious gap. A small one. The kind of gap most people would ignore because nothing appeared missing. But that was exactly the problem. Something should have been there. I called Inspector Thomas Reed. Reed, Archie, you still have the estate records? Yes. I need the original copies. Why? Because Wolf wants me to annoy myself by checking something that probably isn't there. A pause. That sounds like Wolf. It does. Reed arrived shortly afterward with the documents. Together, we compared the original guest records with the household copies. That was when we found it. A missing entry, not removed, not erased, never written, a space where a record should have existed. Someone came in, Reed said. Yes, how do you know? Because the household staff remembered someone. Reed looked at me. They did. Not clearly. That was the strange part. Everyone remembered the scarf. Nobody remembered the person. Again, the housekeeper, Margaret Ellis, had provided the first clue. She had told Reed that Charles Whitmore expected a visitor that evening. But when asked who the visitor was, she could not answer. He said someone was coming, she explained. Who? He did not say. That is unusual. Mr. Whitmore was private. Private enough not to name his guest. Sometimes. That was important. Charles Whitmore had not forgotten to record the visitor. He had chosen not to. The guest was not unknown. The guest was protected. When I returned to the office, Wolf was reading the old Whitmore documents, not the new ones, the old ones. That was another Wolf habit. When everyone else moved forward, Wolf often moved backward, because the answer was frequently hiding in the beginning. You found something, he said. Yes. The guest, maybe. Explain. There was a visitor. Who? Unknown. Number. I looked at him. You know. I know that the person was not unknown. I smiled. There is a difference. Yes. The guest was someone Whitmore knew. Yes. Someone important enough that he allowed them to enter without record. Yes. And someone dangerous enough that the record disappeared. Correct. The next discovery came from the scarf. The symbols woven between the threads had been compared with documents found inside Whitmore's library. They matched. Not exactly. They were not copies. They were references. Like a map. A person who understood the symbols would know where to look. A person who did not would see only decoration. That was the brilliance of the design. The scarf carried information without appearing to carry information. A message hidden in something ordinary. A secret protected by appearance. It reminded me of the walking sticks from the previous case, different object. Same idea, human beings are predictable. They hide important things in places they believe nobody will examine. Then they become surprised when someone finally does. The documents in the Whitmore library revealed something unexpected. The symbols belonged to an old agreement. A private agreement, signed decades earlier by several powerful families connected to Riddle Street. The Whitmore family, the Ashford family, the Langley family. Others, the document was not illegal, not officially, but it contained information that explained years of decisions, property transfers, business arrangements, ownership changes, the kind of information that could destroy reputations if exposed. The agreement had been designed to keep certain matters private. But private and secret were not the same thing. A private agreement protected by law was one thing. A secret protected by fear was another. How many people knew about this? Reed asked. We were back at the estate examining the documents. Wolf had joined us. He stood in the library looking at the old agreement. Originally? Yes. Several. And now? Fewer. Reed frowned. What does that mean? It means people connected to the agreement have disappeared. Dead, some. Moved away, some. Forgotten. Wolf looked around the library. That was the intention. Charles Whitmore had been investigating the agreement because something about it had changed. A name, a signature, a missing page. Something that suggested someone had violated the original terms. The white scarf was connected to that discovery. The person wearing it knew about the agreement. More than that, they knew Whitmore had found something. The scarf was not just a symbol. It was proof of knowledge. That evening, I asked Wolf the question that had been bothering me. Why would the killer wear something so obvious? Wolf looked at me. Because you assume the purpose was concealment. Wasn't it? Number. Then what? Control. I waited. The killer wanted every witness to remember the same thing. The scarf. Yes, why? Because a repeated memory becomes a story. And the story was that a mysterious stranger wearing a white scarf entered the Whitmore estate. I understood. The killer wanted the investigation to follow the scarf. Exactly. Why? Because while everyone followed the symbol, they ignored the person. That was the danger of symbols. People are attracted to them. A white scarf, a strange mark, a mysterious object. They feel important. And sometimes they are. But sometimes they are only a sign pointing somewhere else. The question was whether the killer had made a mistake, or whether the killer had planned everything. Later that night, Wolf reviewed the documents again. The old agreement, the scarf pattern, the missing guest entry, the witness statements, everything. I watched him arrange the facts. That was always the most interesting part. Other detectives searched for evidence. Wolf searched for relationships. He wanted to know not only what happened, he wanted to know why the events could only have happened that way. Archie, yes. The scarf is not the link between past and present. No, number. What is it? The invitation. I stared at him. Invitation. The person wearing it was announcing that the old agreement was no longer hidden. That was a disturbing thought. The killer had not come to the Whitmore estate secretly. They had arrived as a message. They wanted Charles Whitmore to know who they were. They wanted him to understand what was coming. Then they killed him, before the night ended. One final detail emerged. The missing guest entry had not simply been absent. There had been evidence that someone had attempted to create one. A faint impression remained on the page beneath the missing line. Someone had written a name, then removed the paper before the ink fully transferred. A name that had almost appeared. A name that someone had worked to erase. The guest who left no name had not always been nameless. Someone had made him that way. The case had grown larger. The white scarf, the hidden symbols, the forgotten agreement, the missing guest, the erased name, all of them pointed toward the same truth. Someone from the past had returned. Someone connected to powerful families. Someone who knew exactly how to make a secret appear without revealing it. And now we had to discover the one thing the killer had not wanted anyone to find. Who was the guest who entered the Whitmore estate and left no name behind? Chapter 4, The Secret Behind the Estate Walls. There are secrets people hide in locked drawers. There are secrets people bury beneath the ground. There are even secrets people carry with them until the day they die, believing that silence is safer than truth. But the most interesting secrets are the ones hidden in places where everyone has already looked. Because a secret hidden behind a wall is not protected by the wall. It is protected by the assumption that nobody will think to search there. That was the mistake made at the Whitmore estate. For decades, people had walked through those rooms. They had polished the furniture. They had repaired the walls. They had admired the paintings. And all that time, the house had been keeping a record of everything someone wanted forgotten. When I returned to the Whitmore estate with Inspector Thomas Reed, the house felt different. That happens often after a murder. The building itself does not change. The rooms remain the same. The furniture stays where it was. The walls continue standing, but once a death has occurred inside a place, people begin seeing everything differently. A hallway becomes a possible escape route. A locked door becomes suspicious. A quiet corner becomes a hiding place. The human mind has a strange habit of turning ordinary objects into questions after something terrible happens. Fortunately, Nero Wolfe had never needed a murder to make him suspicious of ordinary things. He had built an entire career on it. The hidden room was discovered shortly after noon, not by luck. Wolfe disliked relying on luck. It was discovered because of a small inconsistency in the library. Charles Whitmore's private library was the most important room in the estate. That made sense. Men like Whitmore usually reveal themselves through their books. A person's library often says more about them than their conversations, the titles they collect, the subjects they study, the books they keep hidden, the books they never open. All of it matters. When Wolfe examined the library photographs, he noticed something. One section of the wall had fewer books than the others, not many fewer, just enough. People notice what is missing only when they know what should be there, Wolfe said. At the time, I had not understood. No, I did. The wall was not unusual. The absence was. Behind the shelves was a narrow opening, not a dramatic secret passage, not something from a cheap adventure story, just a carefully constructed hidden space. The kind created by someone who did not want to be discovered. Inside were boxes, old papers, letters, photographs, documents. A lifetime of information compressed into one forgotten room. Thomas Reed looked around. "How long do you think this has been here?" Wolf examined the walls. "Decades," and Whitmore knew. "Yes, then why didn't he reveal it?" Wolf looked at the documents. "Because he had not finished understanding it." The letters were the first important discovery. They were written many years earlier. Some were from family members, some were from business associates. Some were written by people whose names had almost disappeared from Whitmore family history. The letters described a betrayal, not a simple disagreement, not a financial argument, a betrayal that changed the direction of the entire family. One name appeared repeatedly: Jonathan Whitmore, Charles Whitmore's older brother. According to official records, Jonathan had left the family voluntarily after a disagreement. That was the story everyone knew. The problem was that the letters told a different story. Jonathan had not left. He had been forced out. The details were unclear. That was the frustrating part. Old secrets are rarely preserved neatly. People do not usually write. "Today I committed a terrible act. Here are the reasons and evidence." They write fragments, emotional sentences, incomplete explanations, warnings. The letters suggested that Jonathan had discovered something about the family's business dealings, something involving the old agreement, something involving several powerful families. And after discovering it, he disappeared. No explanation, no farewell, no confirmed location. He simply vanished from the family history. "The family believed he abandoned them," Reed said. "No," Wolf replied. "They wanted to believe that." There was a difference. People often accept the explanation that causes the least discomfort. A person leaving is easier to accept than a person being removed. A disagreement is easier than a betrayal. A disappearance is easier than an act of cruelty. The Whitmore family had chosen the easier story. The letters revealed something else. Charles Whitmore had recently discovered evidence connected to Jonathan's disappearance. Evidence that suggested someone inside the family had lied. Summoner not simply hidden Jonathan's fate. Someone had rewritten history. Again, history. That was the pattern. The Whitmore case was not about one murder. It was about people controlling the past. The old agreement, the missing records, the altered stories, the forgotten names, everything connected. That evening, back at the brownstone, Wolf reviewed copies of the letters. He did not speak for almost an hour. That was unusual even for him. I knew better than to interrupt. A person interrupts ordinary silence. Nobody interrupts Wolf's thinking. Finally, he placed the letter down. Jonathan Whitmore did not disappear because of a family dispute. No, number. Then why? Because he discovered something. About the agreement. Yes. The same agreement Charles was investigating. Yes. So Charles found the same secret. Not exactly. I looked at him. What is the difference? Jonathan discovered the danger. Charles discovered the evidence. That was a very Wolf distinction. Jonathan knew someone was hiding something. Charles found proof. And proof was far more dangerous. The white scarf became important again. The symbols woven into the fabric matched references found in the letters. Not the same symbols, the same system. The person wearing the scarf knew about Jonathan. They knew about the agreement. They knew about the hidden room. They knew Charles Whitmore had found the truth. The scarf was not connected only to the present murder. It was connected to a disappearance decades earlier. I asked Wolf the question that had been bothering me. Why would someone wait all these years? He looked at the letters. Because the past was not dangerous until someone reopened it. Charles reopened it. Yes. Then the killer was watching him. Yes. For how long? Long enough. That answer bothered me. Because it suggested planning. Not an impulsive murder, not a crime of anger, a decision. Summoner had waited. Summoner had watched Charles Whitmore search. Summoner had allowed him to get close. Then, when he reached the truth, they acted. The investigation into Jonathan Whitmore's disappearance was reopened. Old records were examined. Old names returned. Old questions were asked. And several people became uncomfortable. That was always a useful sign. Comfortable people usually do not fear investigation. Uncomfortable people often reveal why investigation matters. One person in particular reacted strongly. A respected member of the Riddle Street community. Someone whose family had been connected to the old agreement. Someone who had always presented himself as a protector of local history. That was interesting. Because history is often protected by the people who benefit from controlling it. The most important discovery came from the final letter found in the hidden room. It was written by Jonathan, not sent, not delivered. Hidden, the letter contained only a few lines, but those lines changed the entire investigation. Jonathan wrote, "If the truth returns, do not search for the stranger, search for the person who welcomed him." I read it twice. The person who welcomed him. Wolf nodded. The scarf. I looked at him. The gentleman did not enter the estate alone. Correct. The killer had help, possibly. From someone inside the house. Yes, that was the dangerous possibility. The man in the white scarf was not necessarily the person who planned everything. He might have been the messenger, the visitor, the symbol, the person everyone noticed. While someone else remained hidden, the investigation had changed again. At first, we searched for the gentleman in the white scarf. Then we searched for the meaning of the scarf. Then we searched for the old family secret. Now we had to search for something more complicated. The person behind the person, the hidden connection, the one who opened the door, because the man wearing the white scarf had entered the Whitmore estate. But someone had allowed him inside. Simone had known he was coming. Simone had prepared the way that night. Wolf stood near his desk examining the old family letters. The orchids upstairs were quiet. The city outside continued moving cars past. People walked. New York continued, as if nothing unusual had happened. But inside the brownstone, the mystery had reached another level. The white scarf was no longer simply a message. It was a connection between two crimes separated by decades. Jonathan Whitmore's disappearance, Charles Whitmore's murder, different times, different victims, Samé's secret. And somewhere in the history of Riddle Street was the person who had benefited from both. The walls of the Whitmore estate had finally spoken. Now Nero Wolfe had to determine who had spent decades trying to keep them silent. Chapter 5. The man who wanted to be seen. The most dangerous people are not always the ones who disappear. That is something I learned while working for Nero Wolfe. People assume criminals want invisibility. They imagine a person hiding in the shadows, avoiding attention, escaping notice. Sometimes that is true, but sometimes the opposite is true. Sometimes a person wants to be noticed. Not recognized, not identified, not caught, just noticed. There is a difference. A person who wants to be recognized fears discovery. A person who wants to be noticed controls the discovery. That was the first important understanding in the case of Charles Whitmore's murder. The gentleman in the white scarf had not failed to hide himself. He had succeeded at something much more complicated. He had created a memory. By the 5th day of the investigation, the white scarf had become the most famous piece of fabric in Riddle Street. That was unusual. Most objects connected to murder disappear into evidence rooms, reports, and forgotten files. The scarf had done the opposite. Everyone knew about it. Everyone discussed it. Everyone had an opinion. The newspaper articles called it the mystery of the white scarf. I disliked that phrase. Not because it was inaccurate, because it was too simple. The scarf was not the mystery. The scarf was the question. The real mystery was the person who had created it. At the brownstone, Nero Wolfe sat behind his desk examining the latest reports while I stood near the window. The orchids upstairs had received their morning attention. Fritz had completed breakfast. The city outside was already making enough noise for 3 ordinary cities, and Wolfe was ignoring all of it. That was how I knew he was interested. When Wolfe truly disliked a problem, he dismissed it. When he was interested, he became silent. Silence from Wolfe was never empty. It was crowded with calculations. Archie. Yes, the scarf. Again, everything came back to the scarf. The analysis, complete. And the design is not simply a family symbol. Wolf looked up. Explain. It belongs to something older. Inspector Thomas Reed arrived shortly afterward with the details. The textile experts had examined the woven pattern. At first, they believed it was a complicated decorative style. Then they compared it with historical records. That was when they discovered the connection. The design belonged to a forgotten organization, not a public group, not a political movement. Something private, something that existed quietly for decades before disappearing from official records. The organization called itself the White Circle, a name that sounded dramatic, almost too dramatic. But organizations often choose names that reveal their beliefs. The White Circle believed in preservation records, history, information, the protection of knowledge. At least, that was the official explanation. The unofficial explanation was more complicated. People who control information often convince themselves they are protecting it. The White Circle and the Whitmore family were connected, Reed said. Yes, Wolf replied. You knew, I suspected. Based on what? The scarf. Reed looked annoyed. You keep returning to the scarf. Because everyone else keeps trying to move away from it. That was true. The scarf was unusual. People naturally wanted to explain it quickly. A symbol, a clue, a mistake. Anything that would allow them to move on. Wolf did not move on. He stayed with the uncomfortable detail, because uncomfortable details were usually the ones that mattered. The White Circle had used symbols to identify members, not openly, not like uniforms. That would have defeated the purpose. Instead, they used small details, a pattern, a mark, a piece of jewelry, a particular style of clothing, things ordinary people would ignore, things members would recognize instantly. The white scarf was one of those symbols. But the question remained, why would a murderer wear a symbol that could connect him to an organization? It seemed careless, almost foolish, and that was why it interested Wolf. Wolf had always believed that intelligent criminals did not make mistakes accidentally. Sometimes what appeared to be a mistake was actually the entire plan. The killer wanted the scarf noticed, Reed said. Yes. Why? Because it served a purpose. What purpose? Wolf looked at the photograph of the gentleman entering the Whitmore estate. Communication. I looked at him. To whom? Not us. That answer changed everything. The scarf was not meant for the police. It was not meant for witnesses. It was meant for someone else. The killer had walked through the rain wearing a symbol that only certain people would understand. The witnesses remembered it, but they did not understand it. That was exactly the result the killer wanted. The investigation into the White Circle revealed more history. The organization had formed nearly 50 years earlier. Its members came from influential families, business owners, lawyers, property holders. People with resources. People who understood that information could be more valuable than money. The organization collected old records, private agreements, family histories, documents that could affect reputations. At first it seemed harmless, a group preserving history, but over time the purpose changed. Preservation became possession. Protection became control. The people who guarded secrets eventually began deciding who deserved to know them. That was when the danger began. Charles Whitmore had discovered something about the White Circle, something they did not want exposed. Jonathan Whitmore had discovered something years earlier, something that caused him to disappear. The two events were connected. Different generations, same organization, same fear. The past was returning, and someone wanted to stop it. The next clue came from a photograph found among Charles Whitmore's documents. It showed several members of the White Circle standing outside the Whitmore estate decades earlier. Most faces were unfamiliar, but one was not. A person still living, a person still respected. A person who had spent years presenting himself as someone who protected Riddle Street history. I looked at the photograph. That changes things. Wolf nodded. Yes, someone from the organization survived. More than survived. He remained powerful, Correct. The man's name was Victor Langley. He was considered one of the most respected figures in the neighborhood. A historian, a businessman, a person frequently invited to community events. The kind of man whose reputation made accusations difficult. That was often the most effective disguise. A bad person pretending to be good could be exposed. A respected person with a secret was much harder to question. People defend reputations, sometimes before they defend truth. I asked Wolf the obvious question. Is Langley the killer? Wolf looked at me. Number. I waited. Then he continued. Not yet. That was Wolf's way. He disliked conclusions without complete structure. Meaning, Langley is connected. How? He understands the scarf. That makes him suspicious. Yes. But not guilty. Correct. Why? Because the scarf may have been intended to frighten him. That stopped me. The killer was warning Langley. Possibly. So the person wearing the scarf was not necessarily protecting the organization. Number, they might have been exposing it. Exactly. That was the turning point. The white scarf was not a disguise. A disguise hides identity. The scarf revealed belonging. The person wearing it wanted someone to understand. The question was who? The killer, a messenger, an enemy, a former member. The symbol had two meanings to outsiders. It was simply a strange white scarf, two members of the white circle. It was a message, and someone had delivered that message directly to the Whitmore estate. The witness statements were reviewed again. This time, Wolf focused on something different. Not what people remembered, what they repeated. Every witness described the scarf using almost identical words. Bright, clean, perfect. That was unusual. People do not naturally describe objects in the same way unless something about the object strongly influences them. The scarf had been arranged, folded, positioned. The person wearing it had prepared the appearance carefully. Why? I asked. Wolf answered. Because the appearance was the evidence. I frowned. The scarf itself. Number, the fact that it remained clean. Yes, that detail had bothered everyone from the beginning. A white scarf during rain. Impossible. Unless the rain was not supposed to touch it. Further examination revealed the truth. The scarf was treated with a special protective coating. Not enough to make it unusual, enough to keep it clean. The person who created it had thought about the weather, thought about visibility, thought about witnesses. They had designed the entire encounter. The white scarf was not chosen that evening. It had been prepared long before. This was not a spontaneous act. It was a performance. That evening, back at the brownstone, Wolf sat quietly while I reviewed the evidence. The killer wanted to be seen. Yes, not identified. Correct. Seen by someone specific. Yes, Victor Langley, possibly. Then why kill Whitmore? Because Whitmore understood the message. I looked at him. And someone else did not want him to answer it. Exactly. The murder was not simply about removing Charles Whitmore. It was about preventing a conversation. The scarf was the beginning of that conversation. Before going to bed, Wolf examined one final document, a page from the old White Circle records, a list of symbols used by members. At the bottom was one symbol that had not appeared anywhere else, a white circle crossed by a single line. Next to it was a handwritten note, used by those who reveal what others protect. I looked at it. The person wearing the scarf may not belong to the organization. Wolf nodded. Correct. They may be against it. Yes, then the killer may not be hiding a secret. I waited. They may be trying to expose one. Wolf looked toward the window. Outside, Riddle Street was quiet. Too quiet. The kind of quiet that exists before something changes. The white scarf had started as a strange detail. Then it became a clue, then a symbol. Now, it had become something more dangerous. A challenge. Someone had entered the Whitmore estate wearing the mark of a forgotten organization. Someone had wanted to be noticed. Someone had wanted a certain person to understand. And Charles Whitmore had understood too late. The man in the white scarf had not arrived to hide in the shadows. He had arrived to announce that the past was no longer buried, and someone had killed to make sure that announcement ended with silence. Chapter 6. The thread that connected everything. The most difficult mysteries are not the ones with too few clues. They are the ones with too many. A missing document. A strange symbol. A suspicious person. A forgotten name. Each clue appears separate, and the natural instinct is to solve them one at a time. But some mysteries are not built from separate pieces. They are built from connections. Zone event creates another. One secret creates another. One person's silence allows another person's crime to survive. That was the truth behind the Whitmore murder. The white scarf was never simply an object. It was a thread. And once Nero Wolfe found the beginning of that thread, the entire history of Riddle Street began to unravel. By the 6th day of the investigation, everyone had accepted one fact. The scarf mattered. The disagreement was about why. Inspector Thomas Reed believed it was evidence left by the murderer. That was reasonable. Most detectives would reach the same conclusion. The victim was dead. A suspicious object was found. The object connected to a possible organization. The simplest explanation was that the killer had left it behind. Nero Wolfe disagreed. Not because he enjoyed disagreeing. Wolfe did not argue for the pleasure of argument. He argued because a wrong assumption at the beginning of an investigation could poison everything that followed. The scarf was not left behind, Wolfe said. Reed looked at him. It was found at the scene. Yes, that usually means something. It does. Then why do you say it was not left behind? Wolfe looked at the photograph of the white scarf. Because the person who wore it wanted it found. There was a difference. A person who accidentally leaves evidence makes a mistake. A person who deliberately creates evidence is making a statement. The next step was obvious. If the scarf belonged to a forgotten organization, then someone had to trace its history. That task fell to Thomas Reed. And naturally, Wolfe sent me along. That was the advantage of working for Wolfe. I was rarely allowed to be bored. Unfortunately, I was also rarely allowed to be comfortable. The two seemed connected. The first records came from old textile archives. The scarf was not unique because of its color. White scarves existed everywhere. The importance was in the weaving, the pattern, the hidden symbols between the threads. The same symbols had appeared in documents connected to the white circle. But the design was older than the organization itself. That surprised us. The scarf predates the white circle? Reed asked. Apparently, I said. Then the organization copied it, or inherited it. That possibility changed everything. If the scarf existed before the white circle, then it was not created by the organization. It was created by someone who influenced the organization. Someone earlier, someone closer to the beginning. The records eventually led to a name. Elias Whitmore, Charles Whitmore's grandfather, a man whose name appeared frequently in old Riddle Street records, but whose personal history was strangely incomplete. He had been wealthy, influential, respected. And according to public records, he had died peacefully. But private documents suggested something else. Elias Whitmore had been investigating a secret connected to his own family. The same secret, the same hidden agreement, the same missing truth, the same thread that had now led to Charles Whitmore's murder. Another generation, Reed said. I nodded. Another Whitmore, searching for the same answer. That was the disturbing pattern. The investigation was not new. Charles Whitmore had not discovered the mystery. He had inherited it. Someone before him had searched. Someone before him had failed. Someone before him had disappeared. The white scarf connected them all. The missing person was Eleanor Whitmore, not Charles's niece, a different Clara, a woman from nearly 60 years earlier. She had been Elias Whitmore's assistant and closest researcher. According to official records, she had left Riddle Street after a disagreement. Again that word, disagreement. It appeared too often in family histories. People did not vanish because of disagreements. They vanished because someone wanted a disappearance to sound ordinary. The private records told a different story. Eleanor had discovered evidence involving the white circle before it was known by that name. She had attempted to expose the truth, then she disappeared. The discovery changed the entire case. The white scarf had not simply belonged to a forgotten member of an organization. It had belonged to someone who had tried to destroy that organization's secrecy. The symbol had two histories. Zone's side protected secrets. The other side revealed them. The same mark could mean loyalty or rebellion depending on who wore it. That explained why the killer wanted people to notice it. The scarf was not just a signature, it was a question. Whoever wore it was forcing someone to remember. Back at the brownstone, Wolf examined the information carefully. The scarf belonged to Eleanor. Possibly, I said. Wolf looked at me. Not possibly. You are certain? Yes. How? The pattern. The symbols. Number. The fabric. Number. Then what? The timing. I waited. Explain. Charles Whitmore was investigating Eleanor's disappearance before his death. That surprised me. How do you know? The documents. I looked through the papers. Then I saw it. References to an unnamed researcher. Notes about a missing assistant. A woman who had attempted to reveal something. Charles had not been studying only the family agreement. He had been studying the person who first tried to expose it. That was the connection. Charles Whitmore had not discovered the secret. He had discovered the unfinished investigation. Some unknown before him had started the search. Some unknown before him had left clues. Some unknown before him had worn the same symbol. The white scarf was a bridge between generations. It connected Eleanor Whitmore's disappearance to Charles Whitmore's murder. Two mysteries, one secret, one enemy. The next question was obvious. Who had kept the secret alive for so long? A conspiracy lasting decades required something more than dishonesty. It required maintenance. People had to protect the lie. Records had to remain changed. Stories had to remain consistent. People had to continue pretending. That meant someone had been watching. Someone had been preserving the old version of history. Thomas Reed found the next clue in a forgotten police report. The report concerned Eleanor Whitmore's disappearance. Most of it was routine. But one detail stood out. A witness had reported seeing a person leaving the Whitmore estate the night Eleanor vanished. The description was incomplete. Dark coat, unknown face, white scarf. I looked at Reed. The same scarf. He nodded. The same symbol, the same message, the same warning. The murder of Charles Whitmore was no longer an isolated crime. It was part of a pattern stretching across generations. Someone had spent decades preventing the truth from emerging, and now Charles had reopened the same investigation that had once destroyed Eleanor's life. The killer had not acted because Charles discovered something new. The killer acted because Charles continued something old. That evening, Wolf remained unusually quiet. I knew enough not to interrupt. Eventually, he said, "Archie." "Yes." "What is the purpose of a signature? To identify someone. Usually. Sometimes a signature is not about identity. What is it about? Intention." I thought about the scarf. The careful arrangement, the perfect white color, the hidden symbols, the fact that everyone remembered it. The killer wanted to announce something. Yes, that they were connected to the past. Yes, that they knew about Eleanor. Yes, but why? Wolf looked at the documents. Because someone else was supposed to understand. The realization was unsettling. The scarf had not been worn for the witnesses. It had not been worn for the police. It had been worn for one person. Someone who knew the history. Someone who understood the symbol. Someone who knew what Eleanor Whitmore had tried to reveal. The killer was sending a message, but to whom? The following day, another piece of evidence appeared. A photograph from the Whitmore archives. It showed Eleanor Whitmore standing beside Elias Whitmore. Around her neck was a white scarf. The same pattern, the same design, the same symbol. The image was decades old, but the meaning was immediate. The scarf had survived because someone wanted the message to survive. When Wolf saw the photograph, he did not look surprised. That was annoying. What? I asked. You knew. I suspected. Same thing. Number, I sighed. One day, I will get you to answer directly. That is unlikely. I smiled. Probably true. The case had now reached a deeper level. The white scarf was not merely connected to the present murder, it was connected to the first attempt to uncover the truth. Eleanor Whitmore, Elias Whitmore, Charles Whitmore, 3 generations. Zone hidden crime, one organization protecting the same secret. The killer had not created a new mystery, they had continued an old one. And that meant something important. The murderer was not only connected to Charles Whitmore, they were connected to everyone who had tried to reveal the truth before him. That night, as I looked out over West 35th Street, I thought about the strange power of small things. A piece of fabric, a woven pattern, a forgotten symbol, an object most people would ignore. Yet that object had traveled through decades, carrying the memory of a crime. It had survived because someone believed the truth should survive, too. The white scarf was no longer a clue, it was a witness. A witness that had waited longer than any person could. And now Nero Wolfe had finally found the thread connecting everything. The only question remaining was who had been holding the other end all these years. Chapter 7. The portrait without a face. A person can hide from the world in many ways. They can change their name, they can leave a city, they can destroy records. They can convince people that a different version of history is the truth. But the most interesting way to hide is to remain visible while removing every detail that allows people to recognize you. That was the secret behind the portrait at the Whitmore estate. The portrait had survived for decades. The frame remained. The clothing remained. The symbol remained. Only one thing had been removed. The face. And that was not an accident. By the 7th day of the investigation, the Whitmore estate no longer felt like a crime scene. It felt like an archive. Every room contained a question. Every object had a history. Every wall seemed to have been built around something someone did not want discovered. That was the problem with old houses. They remembered. People could lie. Records could be changed. Witnesses could disappear. But a house often remained exactly where it had always been, waiting. The Whitmore estate had waited for decades, and now it had finally begun revealing what it knew. When I arrived at the estate with Inspector Thomas Reed that morning, the first thing I noticed was the silence. Not ordinary silence. The kind of silence that follows a disturbance, the kind of silence left behind after someone has entered a place they should not have entered. Reed noticed it too. The police secured this property. Yes, and yet someone was here. That was the problem. The estate was under investigation, the library had been examined, the hidden room had been documented, the old family records had been secured, but someone had returned. Someone who knew exactly where to look. The signs were small. That was what made them important. A drawer in the hidden room had been opened, a stack of letters had been moved, a photograph frame had been disturbed. Nothing stolen, nothing obvious. A careless person would have missed it. A normal investigator might have considered it meaningless. But Nero Wolfe had taught me something important. The absence of damage does not mean the absence of intention. Sometimes the most careful actions reveal the most careful criminals. Summoner was searching, Reed said. Yes. For what? I looked around the room. The same thing everyone has been searching for. The truth, exactly. Reed examined the documents. But why come back after we already found the evidence? That was the question. A person who believes evidence has been discovered usually runs. A person who returns usually believes something remains hidden. And someone believed the Whitmore estate still contained one final secret. The answer was found in the west hallway. The hallway had always seemed unusual. Too narrow, too carefully decorated. The walls contained several old family portraits. Most showed Whitmore family members, business leaders, politicians, military officers, people whose names appeared in old records, but one portrait stood apart. Not because it was different, because it was incomplete. It showed a man standing beside the Whitmore family crest. He wore a dark coat, formal clothing, and around his neck was a white scarf. The same scarf, the same pattern, the same symbol, but the face was gone. Not faded, not damaged by age removed. Summoner had deliberately destroyed the face. The paint had been scraped away carefully, not randomly, not violently. Whoever did it had taken time. They had not wanted to damage the portrait. They wanted to erase only one part. The identity Reed stared at it. "How old is this?" "Probably over 50 years, I said. "Number," he pointed. "The damage." That was when we noticed. The frame was old, the painting was old, but the destruction was recent. Summoner had returned. Summoner had found the portrait. Summoner had removed the face after realizing we were close. When we returned to the brownstone, Wolf examined the photographs. He did not need to visit the estate immediately. That was one of his advantages. He could often see more from a photograph than others saw, standing directly in front of the object. The face was removed because the clothing was not enough. I looked at him. "What do you mean?" "The scarf identified the person to those who understood the symbol. Then why remove the face?" "Because the rest of the world needed the face." That was the contradiction. Members of the White Circle would recognize the scarf, others would recognize the person. Someone had tried to remove the one piece of information that connected both groups. The portrait was compared with old White Circle records. The answer appeared quickly. The man in the portrait was Adrian Whitmore, not Charles, not Jonathan. An earlier member of the family, a man who had been described in public records as a respected businessman. But private records told another story. Adrian Whitmore had been one of the founders of the organization that later became the White Circle. He had created the original system of symbols, including the scarf. That discovery changed the investigation. The scarf was not simply connected to the White Circle. It was connected to the person who created it. The symbol had an origin, and that origin was Adrian Whitmore. But the question remained, why would someone destroy his portrait? The answer was obvious, because Adrian Whitmore was not only the beginning of the organization, he was also connected to the original crime. The old documents revealed another hidden connection. Adrian Whitmore had been involved in the agreement that controlled several family secrets. He had created the system designed to protect information. But according to private letters, he later regretted what the organization became. He believed the people who inherited the White Circle had turned protection into control. The same pattern. Again and again, someone creates something for one purpose. Someone else uses it for another. One letter was especially important. It was written by Adrian Whitmore shortly before his death. It contained only a few sentences. "I created a symbol so truth would survive." A pause. "I fear others have learned to use it so truth will disappear." That sentence explained everything. The scarf had two meanings. Originally, it represented protection. Later, it represented secrecy. The person wearing it now could be either a guardian or a destroyer. I brought the information to Wolf. Adrian Whitmore created the symbol. Yes, and the portrait was damaged because someone wanted his identity hidden. Yes, because his connection to the scarf matters. Correct, then the person who damaged the portrait knew the history. Yes, and they are connected to the White Circle, almost certainly. I waited. Who? Wolf did not answer. That meant the answer was close. Very close, but not complete. The investigation into the damaged portrait produced another clue. Behind the painting was a hidden compartment. Of course there was. At this point, I had begun to suspect that every wall in the Whitmore estate contained either a secret or a plan to create one. Inside the compartment was a small collection of papers. Not old papers. Recent papers. Someone had placed them there recently. The first page contained a list, names, dates, connections, the same kind of record Charles Whitmore had been searching for, but the final page contained something different. A message. 3 words. That was the clue, not the end, the beginning. The killer had spent years protecting the past. But the past began somewhere, and Adrian Whitmore was that beginning. The portrait without a face was not simply a damaged painting. It was a warning. Someone wanted to erase the origin of the mystery. Because if investigators understood where the symbol began, they would understand why it existed. And if they understood why it existed, they would understand who had corrupted it. That evening, Wolf sat in his office reviewing every piece of evidence. The white scarf, the old agreement, the missing names, the vanished Eleanor Whitmore, the damaged portrait, the hidden papers. The pattern was becoming clearer, but one piece remained: the person wearing the scarf, the person who entered the estate, the person who wanted to be seen. "The portrait tells us something," I said. "Yes." The face was removed. "Yes." But the scarf remained. "Correct." Meaning the person who destroyed it did not fear the symbol. Number, they feared the identity. Exactly. That was the key. The symbol was not the danger. The person behind it was. For decades, people had focused on the white circle, the organization, the secrets, the agreements. But the real mystery was always about individuals, people who made choices, people who protected lies, people who believed reputation was more valuable than truth. Before the night ended, Wolf made one final observation. "The murderer is closer than we thought." I looked at him. "Because they returned to the estate." "Number. Then why?" "Because they are not trying to remove the symbol." I waited. "They are trying to control its meaning." That was worse. A person destroying evidence wants to hide the past. A person controlling evidence wants to rewrite it. And someone had been rewriting the Whitmore family history for decades. The portrait without a face was the latest attempt, but it had failed. Because the face was not the only thing that identified a person. Sometimes a person's choices revealed them more clearly than their appearance ever could. The white scarf remained, the symbol remained, the truth remained, and somewhere in Riddle Street, the person hiding behind that symbol was beginning to realize something dangerous. Nero Wolfe was no longer searching for the mystery, he was searching for the person who created it. Chapter 8. The gentleman returns to Riddle Street. There is a dangerous moment in every investigation when a clue becomes famous. At first, a clue is useful because it is unknown. It has no reputation, it has no history. It simply exists, waiting for someone to understand its meaning. But once people begin talking about a clue, something changes. The clue becomes larger than itself. People stop seeing what it is. They see what they expect it to be. That was exactly what happened with the white scarf. By the time the second man appeared wearing one, the scarf was no longer just a piece of fabric. It had become a legend. And legends are dangerous things, because they can reveal the truth, or they can be used to hide it. The report came early in the morning. I was at the brownstone reviewing notes from the Whitmore estate investigation when the telephone rang. It was Thomas Reed. That alone was enough to make me suspicious. Reed had developed a habit during the investigation. When he had ordinary information, he sent a report. When he had something unusual, he called. And when he called before breakfast, it usually meant the day was going to become inconvenient. "Archie, Inspector, we have another sighting." I leaned back. Another sighting of what? A pause. Then, the scarf. I looked toward Wolfe. He had not moved, but I knew he was listening. Another white scarf. Yes. Where? Near the old clock tower on Riddle Street. That got my attention. The clock tower, the place connected to so many pieces of the mystery. The place where symbols appeared. The place where secrets were hidden. The place where the past seemed to return whenever it was ready to cause trouble. When I told Wolfe, he did not appear surprised. That was becoming irritating. A normal person hearing that a second man had appeared wearing the same mysterious scarf would have reacted: shock, concern, confusion. Wolfe simply looked at the notes on his desk. The clock tower. Yes. The same location. Yes. Interesting. There is that word again. It remains useful. Sometimes I think you keep it because you enjoy making other people explain what you mean. Number. Then why? Because it is accurate. I gave up. There were certain battles I had no chance of winning. The second witness was Harold Bennett. Unlike Helen Morris, who had seen the first man entering the Whitmore estate. Bennett had seen the stranger near the clock tower. The circumstances were different. The result was the same. He remembered the scarf, nothing else. The man was standing near the tower, Bennett told Reed. Doing what? Looking at it. How long? Several minutes. Did he enter? Number, did he speak to anyone? Number. Then why remember him? Bennett looked confused. Because of the scarf. Again the scarf, the object that controlled attention, the object everyone noticed, the object nobody truly understood. Reed brought Bennett's statement to the brownstone. Wolfe listened carefully. He asked, "What did the witness say about the man's behavior?" Weird checked his notes. He seemed interested in the clock tower, not afraid. Number, not hiding. Number, then why assume he was connected to the murder? Reed paused. I suppose because of the scarf. Wolfe nodded. Exactly. That was the point. Everyone had begun making the same mistake. They were no longer investigating people. They were investigating the symbol. The scarf had become a substitute for reasoning, and that was precisely why someone had created it. The second scarf was examined. At first glance, it appeared identical to the first, same color, same pattern, same woven symbols, but Wolfe noticed the difference immediately. The age. Reed looked at him. What about it? This scarf is older. How can you tell? The fabric. Reed examined the report. The first scarf was newly made. Yes, this one, decades old. That changed the meaning completely. The second scarf was not a copy. It was the original. The history of the scarf was traced through family records. And once again, the Whitmore archives revealed something hidden. The original white scarf had belonged to the Whitmore family line, not the white circle, not the organization. The family. It had been passed down through generations as proof of a connection, a symbol that certain members of the family carried when they believed the truth needed to be preserved. The scarf was not originally a sign of secrecy, it was a sign of responsibility. Summoning had corrupted its meaning. The man near the clock tower was identified. His name was Daniel Whitmore, a distant relative of Charles Whitmore. At first, the name created suspicion. Another Whitmore, another person connected to the estate, another person connected to the secret. But Wolfe immediately rejected the obvious conclusion. He is not the murderer. Reed looked at him. How do you know? Because he wants the truth discovered. That does not prove innocence. Wolfe looked at the photograph of Daniel, but it proves motive. Daniel agreed to meet. He arrived at the brownstone carrying the old white scarf. Not wearing it, carrying it. That distinction mattered. A person trying to create an image wears a symbol. A person protecting history carries one carefully. Daniel placed the scarf on Wolfe's desk. My family kept this hidden for years. Why? Because they were afraid. Of whom? Daniel hesitated. The people who controlled the story. That answer interested Wolfe. Explain. Daniel looked at the scarf. My grandfather believed Charles Whitmore was close to discovering what happened to Jonathan. Jonathan Whitmore? Yes, the missing family member. Daniel nodded. He believed the disappearance was never investigated properly. Daniel explained that he had been searching for the truth independently. He had found references to the scarf in old family documents. He believed the symbol represented the original members of the family who wanted the truth exposed, not protected. The person at the estate was wearing the wrong version of the scarf, Daniel said. Reed frowned. Wrong version. Summonan recreated it. Why? To make people think they were connected to the family. That was the answer. The killer had stolen the meaning of the symbol. They had taken something that represented truth and used it as deception. The first witness had not simply been mistaken. She had been manipulated. The man entering the Whitmore estate had wanted witnesses. He had wanted everyone to remember the scarf, because once the scarf became connected to the murder, everyone would assume the same thing. The person wearing it belonged to the old mystery. The person wearing it was the answer. But that was not true. The scarf was the distraction. Someone used the reputation of the scarf, Wolf said. Daniel nodded. Yes, to create confusion, yes. Why? So people would search for the symbol instead of the person. Exactly. The same strategy had appeared throughout the case. The hidden room, the damaged portrait, the missing records, the mysterious guest. Everything had encouraged people to follow objects, not individuals. The killer understood human curiosity. People love symbols. Symbols feel meaningful. People are harder. That evening, I asked Wolf, the question that had been building for days. If the scarf was a false trail, why make it so complicated? Wolf considered the question. Because complicated things appear intelligent. Meaning, a simple lie is often questioned, and a complicated one, people admire it. That was painfully accurate. The killer had created a story involving old families, secret organizations, forgotten symbols, and historical mysteries. A story so elaborate that people became impressed by it. And while they admired the story, they ignored the author. The evidence now formed a clearer pattern. The first white scarf was modern, created deliberately, used as a message. The second white scarf was old, inherited, connected to the true history. One was a copy, one was proof, one was designed to mislead, one was designed to reveal. The entire investigation had been built around the difference. The next discovery came from the damaged portrait. The hidden documents behind it had included one more detail, a record of the original scarf. The person who recreated the modern version had access to those records. That narrowed the suspects. Only a few people knew enough about the old symbol. Only a few people understood its importance. Only a few people could create the false trail. And among them was someone who had been present from the beginning. When I told Wolf that the suspect list had narrowed, he nodded. Yes, you know who it is. I know who is likely. Same thing, number. I smiled. Still not. Number? Then what is missing? The final connection. The thing that proves everything. Exactly. The case had reached the stage Wolf always preferred. Not the discovery of clues, the arrangement of them. The final answer was no longer hidden. It was waiting. The white scarf had served its purpose. It had brought everyone to the right place, but it had also delayed them. Because the killer had understood something important. People look where they are told to look. They follow symbols. They chase stories. They search for mysteries. But sometimes, the person who matters most is not the person wearing the symbol. It is the person who created the symbol. That night, Riddle Street was quiet. The old clock tower stood above the street. The place where the second gentleman had appeared. The place where the original scarf had been revealed. The place where the truth had moved. One step closer. The gentleman had returned to Riddle Street. But he was not the killer. He was another person searching for the same answer. And that changed everything. Because now we knew the white scarf had two histories. One belonged to the people who wanted truth protected. The other belonged to the person who wanted truth controlled. The final question was no longer, who wore the scarf? The real question was, who wanted everyone to believe the wrong person was wearing it? Chapter 9. The final knot in the scarf. There is a certain satisfaction in watching a complicated machine finally stop making noise. A mystery is much the same at the beginning. Every part moves independently, a clue appears, a person lies, a document disappears, a witness remembers something unusual. Everything seems disconnected. The investigator's task is not simply to collect these pieces. Anion can collect pieces. The task is to discover the machine they belong to. By the time we reached the final stage of the Whitmore investigation, the machine had revealed itself. The white scarf, the forgotten organization, the missing family members, the damaged portrait, the false trail, the hidden records. They were no longer separate events. They were parts of one carefully constructed plan. And, like every carefully constructed plan, it had one weakness. The person who created it, Nero Wolfe, did not enjoy dramatic endings. That surprised many people. They expected a detective of Wolfe's reputation to enjoy standing before suspects and announcing the truth with theatrical confidence. He did not. Wolfe considered drama unnecessary. Facts were enough. Logic was enough. A well-constructed argument did not require decoration. However, Wolfe understood something that many brilliant people forget. The truth is not only discovered, it must be demonstrated. People need to see the path. They need to understand how one event leads to another. They need to know that the conclusion was not a guess. It was inevitable. That was why Wolfe agreed to the gathering. The brownstone office was prepared that afternoon. Not unusually, Wolfe disliked unnecessary changes. The room remained exactly as it always was. His desk, his chair, the books, the quiet order that made everyone who entered immediately aware that they were not in control. Fritz had prepared refreshments. That was Wolfe's way of maintaining civilization while confronting unpleasant truths. A person could face an accusation more comfortably with proper food nearby. Or perhaps that was simply Fritz's talent. Either way, it worked. Those present included everyone connected to the case: Thomas Reed, Daniel Whitmore, members of the remaining Whitmore family, Victor Langley, several individuals connected to the old White Circle records, and one person who had arrived with complete confidence. The kind of confidence that usually belongs to people who believe they have already won. Victor Langley, for years he had been considered a respected figure in Riddle Street, a historian, a guardian of local records, a man who spoke about preserving the past. The irony was almost too perfect, because preserving the past and controlling the past can look identical from a distance. Only the intention separates them. I stood near Wolfe's desk as everyone settled. The atmosphere was tense. Nobody spoke casually. Nobody wanted to appear nervous. Which, naturally, meant everyone appeared nervous. Humans have always been poor at hiding fear. They often believe silence hides emotion. Usually it only amplifies it. Wolfe looked at the group. The murder of Charles Whitmore was not caused by the discovery of a new secret. Everyone listened. It was caused by the return of an old one. He began with the scarf naturally, because the scarf had been the beginning, and endings often return to beginnings. The white scarf was misunderstood from the first moment. Wolfe placed two scarves on the desk, one modern, one old. People believed the scarf was a disguise. He shook his head. It was not. He lifted the older scarf. It was identification. The room remained silent. The original purpose of this symbol was simple. Members of a certain family group used it to recognize those connected to their search for truth. He looked toward Daniel Whitmore, not those who protected secrets. Daniel nodded. Those who attempted to uncover them. The distinction mattered. The symbol had been corrupted over time. A mark created to unite truth seekers had been transformed into a tool of deception. Someone had taken a symbol of honesty and turned it into camouflage. The person wearing the scarf at the Whitmore estate wanted everyone to notice it. Wolfe continued. The scarf was never meant to tell us who the man was. A pause. It was meant to tell one person that someone was continuing the old conflict. Thomas Reed stepped forward. The first witness was not lying. No, Wolfe replied. She was manipulated. Exactly. The gentleman entering the estate had chosen the route, the timing, the clothing, the visibility. He wanted witnesses. He wanted the story to spread. A mysterious man, a white scarf, a connection to an old organization, the perfect distraction. The murderer understood something about human nature. Wolfe looked at the group. People trust symbols. Nobody interrupted. They see a symbol and immediately search for its meaning. They assume the person carrying it must belong to it. He placed the modern scarf beside the original. But symbols can be stolen. The room became quieter. Anyone can wear a message. The important question is, who benefits from that message being believed? That was where the investigation changed. The killer had wanted everyone searching for the mysterious gentleman. They wanted everyone examining the scarf. They wanted everyone discussing the white circle. Because while everyone focused on the symbol, nobody focused on the person who had access to everything. Someone who knew about Adrian Whitmore. Someone who knew about Eleanor Whitmore. Someone who knew about Charles Whitmore's investigation. Someone who knew enough about the scarf to create a false version. Victor Langley shifted in his chair. Only slightly, but Wolf noticed naturally. The person responsible had 3 advantages. Wolf continued. Knowledge. He raised 1 finger. Access. A 2nd finger. And reputation. A 3rd. Without reputation, suspicion arrives quickly. With reputation, suspicion must fight its way through public opinion. Nobody spoke, because everyone understood. Victor Langley had spent years presenting himself as a protector of history, but his connection to the white circle was deeper than he admitted. His family had been involved from the beginning. He had inherited the records, the knowledge, the symbols, but he had also inherited the fear that the truth about Jonathan Whitmore and Eleanor Whitmore would eventually emerge. When Charles Whitmore reopened the investigation, Langley understood the danger. Not because Charles knew the secret, because Charles had found the proof. The hidden room was not discovered by accident, Wolf said. Someone knew it existed. The hidden documents, the altered records, the damaged portrait, the repeated attempts to erase history, all of it connected. The person who damaged the portrait knew Adrian Whitmore's importance. Wolf looked toward Langley. The person who created the false scarf knew the symbol's history. Another pause. The person who removed evidence knew exactly what information was dangerous. Langley finally spoke. This is speculation. His voice was controlled. Too controlled. Where is the proof? That was the question Wolf had been waiting for. Not because he lacked the answer, because he wanted the question asked. The proof is in the scarf. Langley frowned. The scarf, yes. Wolf turned toward me. Archie. I handed him the evidence container. Inside was the final piece discovered during examination of the modern white scarf. A hidden thread, a small section woven differently from the rest. The same technique used by the original family symbol, but this time it contained something different. A record, a signature, a connection. The person who created the false scarf believed the hidden pattern would prove their connection to the old symbol. Wolf explained. They were correct. He paused. But they misunderstood one thing. What? Reed asked. The original creators of the symbol included a method of verification. The hidden thread contained a mark that could only be created by someone with access to the original records, someone who had studied them, someone who had recreated the scarf, someone who had tried to imitate history. The evidence connected the scarf's creation directly to Victor Langley. Not just his knowledge. His involvement, the materials, the design, the hidden alteration, everything. The symbol he used to create authority became the evidence that destroyed him. Langley sat silently. For the first time since entering the room, he no longer looked like a respected historian. He looked like what he was, a man who had spent years protecting something that could not be protected forever. You don't understand, he said quietly. Nobody answered. The families depended on those secrets. Wolf looked at him. Number Langley looked up. They depended on control. The sentence landed heavily, because that had always been the truth. The secrets were never the problem. The people who believed they owned the secrets were. The confession did not arrive immediately. It rarely does. People often resist the truth even when surrounded by it. But eventually, the weight becomes too heavy. Langley admitted his connection, the old records. The hidden agreement, the manipulation of family history, the attempt to frighten Charles Whitmore into stopping his investigation. The murder when fear failed, the scarf was his greatest mistake. Not because it exposed him immediately, because it revealed his arrogance. He believed he understood the symbol better than everyone else. He forgot that symbols carry history, and history remembers. After the police removed Langley, the office became quiet. The kind of quiet that follows completion, not celebration. Completion. Thomas Reed looked at Wolfe. "You knew the scarf was the key from the beginning." Wolfe considered that. Number Reed looked surprised. "I suspected it was important. That is different." "Yes," I smiled. Even at the end, Wolfe refused to make the process sound easier than it was. A good detective does not magically know. A good detective notices. Later, when everyone had gone, I looked at the two scarves resting on Wolfe's desk. One was the beginning. One was the imitation. One represented truth. The other represented manipulation. They looked almost identical. That was the strange thing. The difference was not visible in appearance. It was visible in purpose. And that was the lesson of the entire case. A person can wear a symbol. A person can borrow a reputation. A person can create an image. But eventually, actions reveal what appearances hide. The gentleman in white had spent years believing his image protected him. He was wrong. The scarf had never protected him. It had been waiting to expose him. And when Nero Wolfe finally untied the final knot, the carefully created legend disappeared, leaving only the truth behind. Chapter 10. The Last Gentleman of Riddle Street. A mystery does not truly end when the criminal is discovered. That is only the moment when the question changes. Before the truth is known, everyone asks, who did it? Why did they do it? What were they hiding? After the truth is revealed, the questions become different. What was lost? What was repaired? What lessons remain? That was the final stage of the Whitmore estate case. The murderer had been identified. The hidden history had been uncovered. The false stories that had survived for decades had finally been corrected. But the people of Riddle Street did not remember the case because of the crime. They remembered it because of the object that carried the truth through all those years, the white scarf. The days following Victor Langley's confession were quiet. That might surprise some people. They imagine that solving a major mystery creates excitement. Crowds, celebrations, public attention. But most truths do not arrive with noise. They arrive slowly. They settle into people's understanding. They change the way people look at things they once ignored. Riddle Street changed that way. The houses remained the same. The old trees remained the same. The clock tower continued standing above the neighborhood. But the people who lived there now looked at everything differently. They understood that ordinary things could hold extraordinary histories. A wall could hide a room. A document could hide a crime. A scarf could hide a story. The official investigation into the Whitmore estate murder was completed within weeks. The evidence connected Victor Langley to the creation of the false scarf. The hidden thread inside the fabric confirmed what Wolfe had already concluded. The symbol had been stolen. The history had been manipulated. The truth had been delayed. But it had never disappeared. That was the important part. Secrets can survive for years. Sometimes decades, but survival is not the same as victory. Eventually, someone asks the right question. Eventually, someone notices the wrong detail. Eventually, someone like Nero Wolfe appears and refuses to accept an explanation simply because it is convenient. The forgotten crimes connected to the Whitmore family were officially reviewed. Jonathan Whitmore's disappearance was no longer described as a family disagreement. The records were corrected. The false history was removed. Eleanor Whitmore's attempt to expose the truth was finally recognized. Adrian Whitmore's original intention behind the symbol was restored. The white circle's history was rewritten properly, not as a mysterious organization protecting knowledge, but as a group that allowed power to replace honesty. The truth was not always comfortable, but it was finally accurate, and accuracy mattered. Thomas Reed handled the final arrangements for the evidence. Of all the objects connected to the case, the white scarf received the most attention. Not because it was valuable. It was not. Not because it was rare. It was not. It became important because of what it represented, a reminder that the smallest detail could change everything. Reed decided that the scarf should not disappear into a police archive. It belonged somewhere people could see it. Somewhere the lesson would remain. The Riddle Street Museum agreed to display it. The museum was not large. It was not the kind of place tourists traveled across the country to visit. It was a quiet building with old records, photographs, and objects connected to the neighborhood's history. That made it the perfect place. The scarf was placed inside a glass display. Beside it were photographs of the Whitmore estate, copies of the old documents, a description of the investigation, and a simple explanation. An ordinary object carrying an extraordinary secret. Nothing dramatic, nothing exaggerated, just the truth. I visited the museum with Wolf several weeks after the display opened. Naturally, Wolf did not enjoy the attention. The museum director attempted to thank him. Wolf responded politely, but briefly. That was Wolf. He was willing to solve mysteries. He was less interested in becoming part of their public history. The display interested him more than the praise. That was not surprising. Wolf cared about facts, not fame. We stood in front of the scarf. It looked almost too simple. That was the strange thing. After everything it had caused, it still looked like a piece of clothing, white fabric, carefully woven, nothing more, nothing dangerous, nothing mysterious. But we knew better. The interesting thing, I said, is that everyone saw it from the beginning. Wolf looked at me. Yes. They just did not understand it. Correct. Everyone noticed the scarf. Yes, but nobody noticed what it meant. Wolf nodded. Observation and understanding are not the same ability. That was one of the reasons Wolf was successful. Most people looked. Few people observed. Even fewer people understood. The museum director approached us. Mr. Wolf, there is one thing people keep asking. What? Why did the murderer choose a white scarf? Wolf looked at the display. The answer was simple, but simple answers are often the ones people overlook. Because it was already meaningful, the director nodded. Meaningful to whom? To everyone who knew the history. And everyone else. Everyone else saw only what they were supposed to see. That was the brilliance of the deception. The killer did not create a new symbol. He borrowed an old one. He trusted that people would respect the appearance of tradition without questioning its purpose. For a while, he was correct. Later, back at the brownstone, I found the final note from Charles Whitmore. Wolf had kept it among the case documents, not because it contained evidence, because it contained something else, understanding. The note was short. Charles had written it shortly before his death. If the truth is hidden long enough, people begin to believe the hiding place is the truth itself. But every mystery leaves a mark. Someone only needs the patience to find it. I read the sentence carefully, then I showed it to Wolf. That sounds like something you would say. Wolf looked at the note. Number, no. Whitmore was describing hope. And you don't. I described facts. I smiled. That was probably the closest Wolf would come to admitting the difference. The case of the white scarf became one of the most discussed mysteries in Riddle Street. Children visiting the museum asked about the gentleman who wore it. Older residents told stories about the night Charles Whitmore died. New generations learned about the danger of accepting appearances without examination. The lesson traveled further than the crime itself, because the mystery was never only about a murder. It was about memory, about history, about the way people decide what deserves to be remembered and what deserves to be forgotten. As for Thomas Reed, the case changed him. He remained a careful detective. He still valued evidence. He still followed procedure. But he became slightly less willing to dismiss unusual details. He once told me, before this case, I would have called the scarf a strange clue, and now I call it a warning. That was fair, because a clue asks questions. A warning tells you that something important has already happened. As for Nero Wolfe, he returned to his usual routine. The orchids, the books, the carefully prepared meals, the comfortable chair. To anyone unfamiliar with him, it would appear that nothing had changed, but I knew better. Every case left something behind, not evidence. Not always. Sometimes only a thought, a reminder of human behavior, a new example of how intelligence could be used for good or corrupted by selfishness. The Whitmore case belonged in that collection. Years later, people still walk through Riddle Street and look twice whenever they saw someone wearing white. Not because they expected another murder, not because they believed every stranger carried a secret, because the neighborhood had learned something. Small details matter. A gesture, a word, an object, a piece of fabric. Anything could become the beginning of a truth. And so, on quiet evenings when the clock tower cast its shadow across the street, people sometimes wondered about the gentleman in white. Who was he? Where was he going? What story did he carry? Of course, most people never found out. And perhaps that was appropriate. Because mysteries are not valuable only because they are solved. They are valuable because they remind us to look closer. The last gentleman of Riddle Street was never remembered because of the scarf he wore. He was remembered because of what the scarf revealed. That behind every carefully created image there is a truth, waiting. Behind every forgotten story there is a mark, and behind every mystery, if someone is patient enough to follow the path, there is always an answer.